I think maybe the over-the-top dislikes some fans exhibited towards Dark Souls 2 caused the developers to walk back on ideas that were genuinely better.
Okay, I could spend a good deal of this video defending Dark Souls 2. In fact, I'm going to compile a video looking at the central complaints about it, and why all of them are wrong and lies from criminals, and I'm going to put that up in a separate video a bit later on. When that comes up, I'll put the link here. So, okay, cool. Back to Bloodborne.
Hello there, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the very next part of my series responding to HBomberGuy. Today we're moving on to the next part, which is about the DLC and Scholar of the First Sin. So there is nothing but positive talk about the DLC for Dark Souls 2 from the Dark Souls 2 fans. I think they see the DLC as something that is flawless, while the main game is something they have to accept things like ADP, hitboxes, world building, etc. Which I know I've only mentioned one of those three in this series so far. But that's because I've only been responding to Harris, and this very video is the last time we'll be doing that. The problem is that there are blaring issues that are solely a part of the DLC, and ones that are present thanks to the main game's fundamental design flaws. Regardless, let's hear the arguments for why the DLC is good.
The DLC to Dark Souls 2 is fantastic. Each one experiments with mechanics in cool and interesting ways I don't want to get too far into because we're already pressed for time. Rest assured they're all lengthy enough to feel like worthwhile additions. I'll rattle off the fun stuff I really liked. I like Broom Tower's verticality and the way you unlocked more access from the central hub once you got the key wedge thing.
So we start off with the point, the DLC is fantastic. This will be interesting to see if proven. Next up, he undercuts his own analysis significantly by saying that he doesn't want to go too far in because he's pressed for time. Pressed for time? I would never have thought to hear that from you, Harris. You're easily one of the strongest people on YouTube for allowing whatever time is necessary to take its form for the message to be as concrete as possible. Honestly, it's why my series are so long. It's people like you that kind of convince me that it's more about the message being clear and strong rather than making sure you hit a particular time. Perhaps not anymore then, I suppose. He says they are all long enough to be considered worthy additions. I am happy to agree on that. They can be pretty long, and there's no doubt that most people want that in a DLC. And then he said he liked Broom Tower's verticality. This is not to be confused with Dark Souls 1 verticality, in which everything conjoined on different elevations and intertwined in both the horizontal and vertical manner, having connections that flow in all directions, including diagonally. Broom Tower's verticality refers to it being one long, tall structure with offshoots leading to different areas, which essentially amounts to the usual level design but turned upwards instead and containing a lot more detail. However, he is welcome to like that.
I like Crown of the Old Iron King's gimmick of having the first boss and the Iron King himself be just to your left when you come in, and you can take a series of looping paths around to make the first boss visible, then go around again once the ice melts to gain access to more soldiers for the Old Iron King fight. You could find and build a little army to help you even out the odds, and that's really cool.
So once again he states that this is his opinion, and that's absolutely fine, but let's check it out. He lets slip that there is a gimmick in each of the DLC, and that is true. What it means is that each DLC has a method of lengthening the time that you spend there. Broom Tower forces the player to return back and forth throughout the tower once they find certain keys in order to complete each of the boss fights, and dissolve each of the statues with the smelter wedge. Had all the doors been unlocked from the get-go, the DLC would have been much shorter. Shulver forces the player to make use of rising and falling platforms while navigating a maze with doors that open and close based on buttons, in order to loop you all the way back around to the beginning, and go through another maze in order to reach the double boss fight. Had the place not been filled with 100 possible paths and 97 dead ends from the get-go, the DLC may have been much shorter. Perhaps the most heinous example, however, is the remaining DLC, Ilium Lois. The gimmick here is to force the player to approach the entire land twice with a possibility for 3 times depending on your explorative skills. This is because they have arbitrary blocks up from the beginning. Had all of the exits been open from the get-go, the DLC would have been much shorter. Dark Souls 2's DLCs have tried their best to find ways to extend the content they have within them at all costs. You reapproach the exact same world and have access to content that was simply limited in the first place. This is why I do not enjoy the gimmicks. I consider them weak in some cases and completely arbitrary in others from a gameplay standpoint. Harris describes that process in Ilium Lois as really cool, despite the fact that you really don't have a choice but to search the land once again to find the assistants for the boss fight, as without them the fight is ridiculously difficult, which to me does not scream player freedom whatsoever. However, since he began this section saying "I like," we can just let him have the opinion. That's fine.
I like the puzzles that require you to actually use a bow to progress. The Souls games, when it comes down to it, are something of an offshoot from Zelda, and its attempt to bring some honest-to-God bow and arrow puzzles to the game. It was unexpected, but it fit together quite well. I like these ghost guys who look like phantoms you see online. It actually trips you up when you discover they're real and they attack you. It makes for a cool fake out I just spoiled for you, so I hope you already played this bit.
And there we go, I like is here once again. So it is entirely his opinion, and that's fine. It's never good when a Souls game requires the use of a specific build, but at least here they provide it to you as a way of underhandedly forcing the gimmick. In addition, saying that Dark Souls is an offshoot from Zelda is simply ridiculous to me. These games are so far removed from each other that the comparison almost feels like pandering. Hey guys, remember that game that you like? That's really popular? It's like the most popular game ever. Well, you know the game you like now? They're both similar, so...
In many respects, it is the previous generation's Ocarina of Time. Not just because both games have similar gameplay and fantasy settings, but because they provoke similar reactions when critiqued, that they are unwilling to accept.
Joseph Anderson did the same thing, and one of his legitimate evidences was that you climb a ladder in both games. Just because you fire an arrow in third-person video games to solve a puzzle doesn't mean you are now playing Zelda. Yet he says the whole bow shooting thing, puzzle solving, fits quite well. This is highly subjective, I suppose. I found that it was just so jarringly gimmicky that I knew that I would be relieved the moment they stopped providing platform-based puzzling in a game with terribly bad platforming to begin with. Oh dear, I'm so sorry. Did all of you think that the platforming in Dark Souls was well put together? Platforming was annoying and bad in Dark Souls 1 because of how weak and hard to control the jumping is, combined with the way that you have to be strictly above the platform with your whole body, otherwise you won't make it. On top of that, you roll upon finishing the jump, which can lead to death, since every platforming section is usually surrounded by pits. But even getting back to the asylum has one of the most dodgy jumps in the series in Dark Souls 1. I really wish that Dark Souls 2 didn't have full-on platforming sections, because it once again feels like they're experimenting for experiment's sake. Not playing to the series' strengths, just fucking around with mechanics that are seriously not developed whatsoever. Maybe it would be better if the Dark Souls man could hang off ledges, but he can't. Maybe it would be better if we just stopped doing platform sections, but they didn't. Maybe it would be better if they improved the movement, but they made it far more clunky in Dark Souls 2, and I know I've just triggered at least one person, so we're going to be getting back to that argument in the next part, as I don't want to go too far off topic. The point is, platforming in the Souls games sucks. Stop making us do it. Anyway, moving right along. Harris weirdly has this whole assessment of the ghost dudes in the Crypt area while sharing how interesting it is that you would have mistaken them for ghosts, and he is sorry for spoiling that. Even though they already tried that in the main game and it was annoying as hell, but also that these guys don't look anything like other players. Why would you reasonably assume that these are ghosts of other players? They're way too big. But besides that, they just stay still. Like, this is the way they're introduced to the player. It's as guards that you have to avoid or find a way to kill. I think he wanted to say something good about them and just ran dry outside of the obvious. Even I could have said something more substantial, like it's interesting that you essentially need to find their power source and destroy it before they destroy you, or something like that. But he kind of copped out here, or he completely forgot that this gimmick has been used already, again showing his own knowledge of the game.
Sin the Slumbering Dragon is a hard fight, but the first really fun fight with a dragon in basically any of these games for me personally, especially after the optional Ancient Dragon fight, which is honestly a chore. In many ways, the DLC embodies Dark Souls 2 in microcosm, being willing to go all the way and experimenting with its mechanics to create new and unique areas, and in doing so, it also comes to embody the very best the Souls series has to offer as a whole.
So everything about Sin was subjective, as he said, for me personally, but again, I would like to explore some stuff. First, he calls it a hard fight, which is obviously subjective, but if you have life gems, which at this point should be stacked at 99 easily, then it is far from difficult, as you simply need to outlast him, and since you almost have infinite health, you'll be fine. Secondly, he says that it is the first really fun fight with a dragon. If you want a hard and fun fight with a dragon, Calamite is your guy, but at least he admitted to the Ancient Dragon being incredibly dull, which is an understatement for that horrid boss. Next up, he says that the DLC for Dark Souls 2 embodies the game in microcosm, which I agree with. It focuses on annoying gimmicks and changes from its prequel, with broken fundamentals and landscapes made difficult by convoluted locks forcing you to make roundabout runs through it, and subsequently horribly balanced enemies. Enemies with high health, high damage, high agility, high numbers, etc. Harris, on the other hand, considers it all unique and new. He then says it embodies the very best the Souls games have to offer, while supporting that statement with barely anything.
It's everything that I think I ever wanted from a Souls game, and it's part of Dark Souls 2, so Dark Souls 2 wins.
So he said it was everything he wanted, and Dark Souls 2 wins, while saying that the Squalid Queen fight is the best two-person fight. Which, I mean, the best two-person fight's obviously the Twin Dragon Riders in reality. They're way more evidence and reason. And there it is, the DLC section is over. That was so jarring to analyze and respond to because this is the crux of every Dark Souls 2 advocate's argument, explaining in full what the DLCs offer and how they make up for the main game and push it past Dark Souls 1, yet Harris brushes over them so fast you kind of lose any kind of understanding that they are even relevant. The analysis of the DLC constitutes 1.5 minutes of his 80-minute video about why Dark Souls 2 is good. This is why people wanted someone else defending the game. Harris is blissfully unaware of the strengths of Dark Souls 2. He gets it confused with its blatant weaknesses. But don't worry, I'm going to cover them in full as we progress past this video. Ultimately, it would seem that Harris rushed this segment for the sake of making a more digestible video, but this is a bizarre comment coming from him, considering that he would usually make a two-parter or more of a video series, or hell, make it 1 million parts like I do. But more importantly, anyone remember when he said this once upon a time?
Good criticism means good discourse. I can completely see why writers, critics, and journalists use the shorthands they do, but I think the onus is on us to try not to. To be willing to be long, complicated, willing to be, even a little bit boring or pedantic at times in order to explore the qualities of gaming experiences in a truly valuable way.
What happened to that principle? To take as long as is needed to explain to your audience the reasoning and experience behind the content and how it was made for that. It's honestly something I really want to stick to myself, and one of the most common criticisms I receive on Reddit for my videos is that they're too long, but once people actually give them a shot, that criticism suddenly fucking evaporates. I don't know what Harris was thinking with this move, but we are gonna swiftly move on ourselves to Scholar of the First Sin now, and this is where it gets really funny.
Scholar of the First Sin is a second edition of Dark Souls 2 that came out nearly 2 years ago now. It bundled together the DLCs for the original release of the game, had some graphical and performance updates, and put the items that grant access to the DLC in the world itself as things to find instead of items you simply start with if you owned the DLC in the previous version.
Well, he is right about all of that, but I have already summarized why it's an extremely shady business practice, and for some reason Harris doesn't seem to care, despite even Joseph Anderson weighing in on the subject.
$25 for some revamped enemies and a few graphical upgrades that bring it closer to the quality first advertised in their reveal trailers. This goes beyond greed.
This is very important to keep in mind because of how ridiculous this section gets.
This version's really interesting. I'm not going to say good, interesting. Instead of a simple, slightly visually improved bundle, it actually dramatically changes most of the game. Almost all of the enemy encounters and placements have been altered, and the amount of enemies has overall increased massively. I've played Dark Souls 2 multiple times before playing this version, and I found it to be very different and much harder, despite superficially being the same game.
He says the version is interesting, but he refuses to label it as good. Now that should give you a strong impression of how much of a terrible addition to the series it was. Don't get me wrong, there was a ton of issues with Dark Souls 2 at the base, but this additional game added all of the shady business changes, but also just random enemies here and there to add nothing in terms of content, just more difficulty, more things. Harris says it dramatically changed the game, altering every enemy encounter. This is not true. There are several that are reduced or added or swapped, but the games themselves can often be mistaken for the same without a careful eye. This next statement, though, is another burn against Scholar in that he says the game is very different despite superficially being the same. Basically, they didn't change anything of note. There wasn't a better experience to be had. They just arbitrarily threw in and took out enemies regardless of the context to convince players that they were playing a new game or a definitive version of Dark Souls 2. Like, I don't know if this is getting through to you. It's pretty fucking disgusting to take your existing game, to change a bunch of spawns and then sell it as a new game. Of course, the more significant details like 1080p and 60 FPS are significant changes, but they should not be in another fucking release.
It's more frustrating too. A lot of people didn't like the amount of enemies you often fight at once in Dark Souls 2, something I didn't have a problem with in that game, but in this it's definitely difficult enough to be annoying even if you know how to deal with groups in this engine.
Now he's admitting that there is indeed spam in Scholar but not in Dark Souls 2. How does he qualify it? He won't, but he makes it clear that the base game is fine and it's testing crowd control while Scholar is a victim of spam. Unless you qualify it, I would say your distinction is arbitrary. Spam takes place heavily in both games, there's no doubt.
Honestly, the game this reminds me of the most is Super Mario Bros. 2. The Japanese Mario 2 is like an optional harder Mario game, pushing the engine and player skill requirements to the absolute limit, before it becomes unsellable as a consumer product. Heck, they didn't even bother selling it in the West for a reason.
I'm sorry, but to justify Scholar, you're comparing it to a game that was stopped from being sold to massive amounts of audiences because it was assumed to be unplayable. Someone remind me, how in the hell is this a defense for Dark Souls 2 at this point?
I'd call Scholar a pretty good game. It's challenging, it's entertainingly funny in places, and it's a nice way of playing a game I love dearly in a new, remixed way. However, I have to qualify calling it good. It's good only within the context of Dark Souls 2 already existing, of there being about a year of playing the original version to prepare for this one. I would not recommend this game to anyone as a first game in the series, which for some people this might have saddeningly been.
He begrudgingly calls Scholar of the First Sin a pretty good game, and that it's funny in places, but he doesn't provide an example of that, nor does he explain what that even means. But then he describes Dark Souls 2 as a game he loves dearly, which should actually reveal the motivation for this video entirely, and it doubles as explanation on why this video is filled with emotional responses to arguments, as compared to his better content. He has been basing concrete conclusions on subjective evidence and experience. He then hilariously asserts that you shouldn't play Scholar unless you have at least a year of Dark Souls 2 under your belt, that people who play it as their first series is something he wouldn't recommend. He doesn't really specify why in any kind of detail, but I think it's more to do with the fact that he doesn't want to criticize his dear love any more than he already has. The reality is that this thing is marketed to customers as the complete edition, the director's cut, the definitive edition, the perfect time to play Dark Souls 2, the game to bring Game of the Year to a whole new level, with the gameplay of Dark Souls 2 but refined and improved, even though half of its features were provided to the base game owners, that being the new boss, the new lore, the new item descriptions, the improved matchmaking, but half were arbitrarily placed behind a paywall, such as 1080p, 60 FPS, new enemy placements, new AI, the ability to have more players to play together, not to mention that the games run on DirectX 9 and DirectX 11 respectively, which means it causes major issues for those who want to play together, and it creates different sources of support for both. This is the kind of shit you should be giving players at the base. Who the fuck cares about getting Aldir as a boss compared to playing in 60 FPS? Needless to say, if you check the Scholar trailers on YouTube, the comment sections are filled with hatred for the developers and their business choices, as they should be, and Harris is not going to be telling you about any of this. There was heavy controversy in the original release for Dark Souls 2, being that of lighting differences, changes in development as the time went on, and not to mention that there was a particular set of masks that everybody wanted that never showed up in the way that they were presented. Anybody who's a remote fan of the Souls series and looked after Dark Souls 2 when this was all going on would know a lot about this. And yet it doesn't pop up here. He instead has an extremely milquetoast assessment of the content in hopes that you will come along to the side that, hey, this was all ages ago, we can appreciate the content for what it is now, right? Anyone who has concern for the consumer and retains any sort of principle when it comes to developer decisions should be condemning Dark Souls 2 and From Software for the choices surrounding Dark Souls 2 as a whole. But why don't you tell us again who this content is for, Harris?
It's for people who are diehard fans of the series already, or even just fans of 2 specifically, and for those people, even when it's not fun, it's fun as an entertaining little experiment with a bunch of aspects of the game tweaked just enough. It feels almost like a ROM hack of Dark Souls 2 they made for fun, and for some people that might be a condemnation, especially considering it's the cost of a full-priced game. So I can't heartily recommend it, but the Souls games are quite difficult to recommend already.
I'm afraid that you're wrong. As we've discussed already, it is intended for gamers to play as the intended Dark Souls 2 experience directly from the developers as a completed work. Now your argument is that it is good if you look at it from a ROM hack or an experiment perspective? This is clearly where the argument has begun to buckle under the pressure of the quality of the content. He is having a huge amount of trouble trying to say anything good about this, but for the sake of the narrative he cannot criticize it or condemn it either. He then shows a sliver of honesty and admits that at the least, it's a full price charge while being an extremely similar game. Of course, he is forgetting that those who own Dark Souls 2 get the discount, but hey, it sucks when I have to break my narrative and defend Dark Souls 2 for him, right?
Something I like specifically is the entrance to the Earthen Peak from Harvest Valley. There's a couple of enemies in the original, but it seems quite underutilized, like it's a short, quick rush through an area that could be more fleshed out. In Scholar, it's significantly altered. There's way more enemies, it's way more difficult, there's purposeful traps for if you try and run past, and it has more enemy types that appear in like 2 places in the original game, which is nice.
Well, the arguments for the quality and changes are not over. Now we're talking about how they added more things in an area and repeated assets in order to make something, according to Harris, more fleshed out and nice. I think you can tell when he's running out of steam because his language falters to the point of describing things as cool, nice, neat, interesting, rather than explaining why this is the case. He's mostly twisting the perspective of simply adding more enemies here, but he says it's something he likes. so it's fine.
There are also more hidey knights in general, which is great, and something I wanted. And also they're way more aggressive. Some of them get up and go for you now, and that's a really cool thing that you just don't expect if you play the original, and that's really, really fun.
This is getting ridiculous now. The Hyde Knights were removed from several spots in the original game and placed into Hyde's Tower of Flame. There wasn't a significant increase in numbers in the entire game, and again, he shows he doesn't play his own game that thoroughly. There are only 2 Hyde Knights that attack you in the opening area, and they're both close to the Guardian Dragon copy and paste. No other Hyde Knights will engage you without being provoked, but after you kill the Dragon Rider, they all aggro towards you in this area. Overall, these are arbitrary changes that Harris has deemed cool and fun, that often serve to frustrate people immensely as the fight pattern on the Hyde Knights themselves are horribly telegraphed. This, while combining the fact that the enemies are quite tough and aggressive and aggro to you from far away, makes the whole area pretty difficult, to be honest, but that's kind of throughout the game without life gems.
Also, something I quite like about both games is that in each one, someone's credentials are called into question. In the original, in Heidi's Tower, the Dragon Rider looked like an idiot. There were no dragons anywhere for most of the game. Why is he called the Dragon Rider? What? That's ridiculous. The guy's obviously lying. But in Scholar, it's the Dragon Slayer just over the way from him who's clearly lying on his resume. There's a dragon right outside his fucking office.
I don't actually have anything to say about this. I honestly, I've kept it in for the sake of context, but I think he's just running out of things to talk about at this point.
Don't get the Scholar Edition unless you similarly really like 2 already, and don't approach it as its own game per se, but as another way of playing a game you already liked for what it was doing, and you'll probably have a good time. I honestly want to see more games like this. I would have liked a similar edition along these lines for every Souls game, to be honest.
So he offers his opinion on when you should play Scholar of the First Sin, which is fine. Personally, I would not recommend playing either of the games if you have a high standard when it comes to video game construction, as you will be frustrated and disappointed with many of the elements throughout the game. As one of my subscribers put it, Dark Souls 2 and all content associated with it is a literal garbage fire, and that really seems poignant to me, but that will yet to be proven in the final part. Regardless, Harris says he would like to see the attitudes of Scholar for the rest of the Souls series, and he is dangerously wrong about this. Do not encourage the practices of reselling a game at the performance it was supposed to have at launch. Do not support a developer without a conscience. It will only serve to bite you in the ass one day, and you'll be saving yourself the trouble. Do not listen to Harris on this. I'm not even talking about opinions anymore. This is just fucking stupid. Do not encourage shit like Scholar of the First Sin to happen in the future. Regardless, this is the end of the section on DLC and Scholar of the First Sin, and Harris has rather disingenuously bungled it together to place one of the worst parts of the development of the game and one of the best to level them out, I suppose. Scholar is a blatant attempt at making more money, and I couldn't really sum it up better than Joseph Anderson did.
This goes beyond greed.
Now we come to Harris's conclusion, and this is more about the perception of games journalism towards the game, its process, and why Dark Souls 2 ended up with the reputation that it did.
Obviously, a lot of game criticism is based on subjective experience, which can't exactly be proven wrong, sadly, but that's not what I'm trying to do here. My aim as a critic isn't just to try and find ways of looking at and analysing games and their design that are useful and help in forming better ideas of quality, but also to try and understand and explain why other people reacted differently.
Okay, so he says that a lot of games criticism is subjective, and he is bang on the money. When you have Joseph Anderson telling you that parts of Dark Souls aren't fun, or parts of Soma aren't interesting or scary, it is objectively provable that he is taking a subjective experience and passing it off as a fact. This is bad writing, but it would ultimately be called subjective, regardless. When I tell you that the motivation in Outlast doesn't make a lot of sense and that they treat moving from certain areas to others as a ride, I will explain that it can have a detrimental effect on your immersion as a player, and ultimately this would be up to you to decide how much it bothers you personally, but I would still bring it to your attention. This would be objective analysis with reference to a subjective experience. This is pretty much my goal on YouTube, to provide a better caliber of analysis to those who are currently on offer, to delve far deeper to the content and build a scale for it. I am willing to accept that I still make a huge amount of mistakes in the language I use, and honestly I am getting there in terms of reaching a state where I stop pissing people off in the comments section. But for now I can settle for simply doing a more thorough job than most of these fucking people. These guys will assert that they are objective and analytical, showing holes in other people's logic or arguments and showing the game to be something that everyone else missed, but then the communities follow suit and talk about how everything is subjective and so it is fine. Like I said in the beginning, this is a myth. There are many objective things to say about many forms of design involved with a game. What these things do in terms of a final product judgment is completely different to what emotion it may elicit from someone personally. The point here is that Harris said that people can't exactly be proven wrong, but this video series stands as what happens when you put massive effort into fact-checking and discussing the ideas of your average YouTube intellectual, of which I am very much a part of, but my work isn't good because I'm smart or anything, it's good because I put time in, and that's what actually matters. Judging from the armor he's wearing in the footage and what weapons he uses, it looks like he played Dark Souls 2 maybe twice. He skipped Dark Lurker, several important builds, and didn't even try to explore the negatives of the game to provide a balance. This video of his was rushed. It may have taken him long compared to other videos in his YouTube channel, but for the content we're covering, it was rushed, and he's made a plethora of mistakes, thus proving much of his subjective analysis to be inaccurate. He then comically asserts that he isn't just looking to inform better ideas when it comes to design, he's also looking to learn from those who disagree, which I'm afraid is fucking bizarre considering how he's been responding to Matthewmatosis. Harris has misunderstood much of the source material from both games, as well as completely misrepresenting his peers. He didn't want to learn from Matthewmatosis. In fact, I believe his intentions were very clear.
It is necessary that this critique be defeated and destroyed at all costs.
Regardless of that, let's push on.
I've had some pushback from people on some of my long game analysis videos. Usually by people who enjoyed a game I was being critical about, or didn't enjoy a game I liked, or who played the game a way I said was wrong and happened to like it. I in no way mean to diminish other people's experiences of a game. If you didn't like something, I can't reason you into liking it. My aim is to understand why people do or don't like something and learn from that and use the information in my work.
He says he received pushback for his work, which makes a lot of sense because Harris makes very controversial videos with a certain level of smugness that can very much anger people. Put that with the fact that he has now dealt a very controversial hit to Matthewmatosis and his reputation gets a little more contentious as time goes on. There are a myriad of reasons his audience disagrees with him. Some justified, some are not, but this applies to many content creators and doesn't really have relevance here because of what he is leading up to saying.
I in no way mean to diminish other people's experiences of a game.
It is really hard to listen to him say this because of the absolute hypocrisy his video displays. The fact that he will often and loudly explain that people don't understand the simple truth, or go as far as saying people play the game wrong. He'll do all of that but turn around and say he respects the analysis and would never diminish another person's experience. Is that really true?
I in no way mean to diminish other people's experiences of a game. This looks a whole lot like playing the game wrong and blaming the game for it. I in no way mean to diminish other people's experiences of a game. And he's still using a shield. Aw, bless. Someone really liked the previous games and tried real hard not to unlearn what they learned there.
Totally not diminishing in any way. He claims that he just wants to understand why people feel the way they do, which normally would be fine, but he still hasn't addressed the majority of Matthewmatosis' video's criticisms despite saying he wants the video destroyed. Seriously, he wants to destroy the video in terms of argumentation, and yet he's tackled about 2% of it. And even those points were misrepresented.
I've gone on record as thinking the Souls games are all very good, but that doesn't make other people not liking them or not thinking that wrong. They're useful because you learn why people wouldn't enjoy something, and that's really helpful if you, for example, are interested in what makes a game fun to a lot of people, which is really financially lucrative nowadays.
Harris then talks about how opinions work, but I have to say I disagree here. If someone says they personally like something and they won't be changing their mind, that's fine. If someone says a game is bad in fundamental design aspects, when it is proven to be good, that would make them wrong. Subjective versus objective. This is something I'm going to continue to push on my channel because I honestly think it's a problem in modern conversation. And it has nothing to do with some kind of obsession with proving my opinions correct. It's about creating a scale where we can all be on the same page and understand a product's quality but appreciate the experiences you can gain from it. It isn't a smart idea for a YouTube channel to be saying that there is such a thing as objectively good and bad video games, but my group of viewers are small, so I don't have to worry about pissing off hordes, and we can talk about it in the comments section if you guys would like. That's absolutely fine. My issue is we aren't going to get anywhere in discussion if we can't agree on the idea that things can be done well or not, and how to identify those things. This is something Harris will employ in his other videos, but sometimes he lets it loose and calls for subjectivity when the product is harder to defend, or harder to criticize. Weirdly, he makes a point about financial benefits of talking about video games. Now, I have no idea what he's implying about people's motivations there, but I don't understand how it could possibly not be turned around on himself as well, so let's just ignore it.
I feel the game's got better at correcting the sort of problems that caused not a lot of people to enjoy them early on, at least without a lot of friction at the start, and somewhat interestingly, help them go back and appreciate the previous ones. Everyone's entitled to their opinion, and in my opinion, every other game critic is stupid.
He makes the point that newer Souls games have been able to correct issues in which people weren't enjoying them as much before and allow people to go back and appreciate the others. This again comes from that one friend he has, and to counter, I have over 4 friends I could name that have openly admitted that Dark Souls 2 made them appreciate how good Dark Souls 1 is and that Dark Souls 2 was awfully constructed. These are both anecdotal and honestly get in the way of the conversation. I guess they're interesting though. He then says everyone can have their opinion, in this case conflating the view that something is fun with the criticisms Matthewmatosis brought to the table. These two things are not the same thing. Then he says for a joke that every other critic is stupid, but as he makes clear in his own video, he actually would like to kind of just say that as a joke, but he genuinely believes it, and he's going to explain what he means.
Okay, I can't even make that joke here. You see, the overly negative critical response from Souls diehards and some spheres of the internet isn't even accurate to what most game critics said when the game first came out. On the whole, people loved it. The misgivings came specifically from folks like Matthewmatosis, and the popularity of his video, predicated centrally on how the game couldn't possibly be as good as the first because Miyazaki didn't make it, and locking on in some fights isn't a good idea, and the opening cutscene didn't talk about a war that already happened and has no effect on us as a player.
Okay, he says first that the overly negative critical response from the Souls diehards in some spheres isn't relative to the perspectives of game critics when the game released. To simplify that for you, he is saying, Souls fans have a different perspective now compared to critics when the game first released. Whether or not this piece of evidence is remotely true or false, it is an absolutely bizarre piece of evidence to bring up. Literally another worldly argument. Are you saying that it is strange that people who take a huge amount of time to explain and comb through the ideas of a video game disagreed with those who released a day one review? The people who passionately loved the games and development disagreed with those who are doing this for day one views and money. This seems natural to me. What's the issue? What does that even prove? He then sums up Matthewmatosis' video with 3 points. The game can't be as good when Miyazaki didn't make it. Locking on in some fights isn't a good idea. The opening isn't about a war. This is pretty much just an insult to Matthewmatosis entirely. It really sucks from my perspective because I look at Matthewmatosis and I see like similar effort to what I go through to put these fucking videos together, and to see it reduced by someone like HBomberGuy to those 3 statements, that's just really sad, and shit like that shouldn't really happen on the internet. Like, it's always nice to have a sort of equal amount of appreciation for the work that you do compared to how much effort you put in. Like, Matthewmatosis is pretty much set in that department. He has a huge amount of fans that can appreciate his work, but there are plenty of people who won't be able to have that. There are plenty of people who will literally just be looking at a criticism like that, and they'll be convinced that their work is no good, so why would they put that much effort in the first place? Like, it's a fair point. Why should anybody put the effort in to make a 10-hour video series, in-depthly going through every single problem in a game, while providing as much evidence as they can, and simple argumentation to get their points across, when it can be reduced to that? I can only imagine what Matthew would have said about the game if Scholar had released by the time he had made his video, because it probably would have been a lot worse. Harris has responded to barely any of his video. In fact, it's kind of evident that he didn't listen to any of the video, and he is now hilariously trying to convince you that he's wiped the floor with it. This is in aid of saying that the opinion of Dark Souls 2 from the world has changed thanks to Matthewmatosis, and he is fucking right. Matt gave people what they needed to explain themselves. He put into words and evidence what they felt. Harris, on the other hand, in addition to several other arguments, has said things like,
It was already complete in its incompleteness.
But despite that, he is implying that Matt is the one that's using weak argumentation to change the perspective people have on a game, which isn't helping people explain anything for themselves. All he's done is fuck the argument about Dark Souls 2.
Ignore how, in Dark Souls 2, there's a similar ancient war in the distant past, but you get to learn about it over the course of the game instead of a pre-rendered cutscene at the beginning, and then you get to actually go fight in it? Critics at the time of release liked it a lot, the exact same way critics liked Demon's Souls a lot back when this whole series was new and strange and not many people played or liked it. People who think about games a lot are more likely to easily get into a new experience than people who just play them as a hobby.
So he says the war between Vendrick and the Giants is better delivered as something to learn about than see in a cutscene. There's a lot to talk about here, but how much you like each delivery method is really up to the audience. The cutscene in Dark Souls built the world as to why the war happened, what happened as a result, and what the major players of the war are doing now. And what the major players of the war are doing now is the game. You will read about those things and talk to people about them, the once great dragon fighting heroes reduced to what they are now. Dark Souls 2 has a similar method of discovering the details, but fighting in the war? You go to 3 memories where a small patch of land is given a filter and a set of enemies we've already seen with the goal of killing a very lackluster boss as the highlight. Both of these wars are just as distant and relevant to their respective games, but the idea that an opening cutscene is inherently bad is ridiculous when stripped of intentions and effects, and who even knows what the War for the Giants was about without delving into the lore? I really don't see much of a difference between either of these things, and besides, many people, including people like Joseph Anderson, consider the giant memories to be absolute shit. Next, he says that critics liked Demon's Souls a lot when it released, and they liked Dark Souls 2 when it released. This is completely irrelevant. The day one critics should not be trusted for anything aside from opinion as far as I'm concerned, and even then they are weak with supporting evidence. I have no idea how he thinks this is going to support any kind of argument. He says,
people who think about games a lot are more likely to easily get into a new experience than people who just play them as a hobby.
I really don't think that can be proved. People who think about games, what does that even mean? Are you saying those who take their time with games rather than treating them as a hobby are better at getting into new experiences? I will let him develop this.
Internet critics like Yahtzee wiped their ass all over various aspects of the games that would later say they loved when audiences started to get a hang of the games and it turned out they were talking bollocks.
Fuck you, Demon Souls. A challenge is one thing, but trying to break down a fucking cement wall with your forehead isn't a challenge, it's grounds for getting fucking sectioned.
Demon Souls is one of the most rewarding, challenging games ever to hit the PS3. It may not be for everyone, but I still urge everyone to at least try it.
And GameSpot's 2009 Game of the Year is... Demon Souls.
Demon Souls is like nothing you've ever played.
Yahtzee is a great critic for the fact that he is witty and fast. He isn't exactly super accurate with a lot of his work. I imagine that's down to the fact that he covers so many games so quickly. Taking his perspective alone on Demon Souls seems a little disingenuous and retarded as an example of internet critics changing their mind over time. And by the way, GameSpot, GameRadar, and IGN are easily considered internet critics as well, whether or not they are also laughingstock. The point here is that Harris is saying that the knee-jerk reaction from critics isn't accurate to the quality of the game, and the critics like IGN and GameSpot are usually the canary in the coal mine for the actual quality of a game. He is monumentally wrong. To use them as examples of accurate games journalism is beyond hilarious, and they get shit wrong constantly. Just look at the fact-checking they get in their average reviews from the comments section. Hell, the Yooka-Laylee and Outlast reviews were awful, and I expected that going in, but I still had to watch through all of it. It has become a meme to not listen to these people, and they are welcome to make their money from trailers, interviews, and top 10s, but don't tell me people actually respect their perspective, Harris. Come the fuck on.
Do you hear that?
It was the best and most innovative game of 2009.
That's Kevin Van Flipping Ord. That's the thought criminal who was so wrong about Fallout 3 he was found dead in his cell last year, next to an apology written in my blood. Even he has been on the ground floor of the Souls series since day one. It turns out that professional game critics are quite often more ahead of the curve than the average consumer, or the, not to be rude, fanboy types who will dismiss a sequel for being too different to the one they first fell in love with.
So there's a lot to unpack there. Firstly, he openly provides an example of when day one critics have been drastically wrong, yet will conclude that they are right about the Souls series. That is absolutely stupid, and he knows it. He says that Kevin has been on the ground floor of the Souls series since day one, which means absolutely nothing, when the premise for this video is that everyone who loved Dark Souls 1 got Dark Souls 2 wrong, despite implying here that Kevin is very consistent compared to everyone else. Besides, somebody who loved all of the games, it shows they don't have taste, since there is something huge to say about the quality of each game and how different they are as the series progresses. Harris then refers to people at IGN and GameSpot as professional games critics, which is bizarre as anyone who is paid to critique games is technically professional. Hell, I'm currently on $14 a month, so I'm arguably a professional. I swear to God, the next time I check that, it's going to go down now. So this distinction is useless to the discussion, but he uses it to call Matthewmatosis a fanboy who is dismissing the sequel of the game they first fell in love with. This is probably the hardest part to listen to of all of his embarrassing slants at Matt. He degrades the guy's work as a result of being a fanboy and claims he is dismissing it because of the love he has for the first game. If you knew Matt's other work, you would know that he loves Demon Souls, so apparently he doesn't quite have that unwavering love for the first, since he loved Dark Souls 1 subsequently. But I find it interesting that you accuse him of dismissing content due to a blind fanboyish love when you're literally spending over an hour to respond to highly specific points in his video while ignoring hundreds of others that he makes. Comparatively, I've responded to every point you've made. I can only imagine you avoid responding to his points because you couldn't defend your game, and it is your blind love for it that made you omit or dismiss them entirely. But that is, of course, just a theory.
Mainstream game critics can be wrong, but they've been consistently right about the Souls series from day one. It's only corners of the internet full of rose-tinted fanboyishness towards the first Dark Souls that result in the ridiculous treatment of the second game. When it comes down to it, Dark Souls was a fantastic game, even though it's flawed in a lot of ways that are so much more obvious now than ever.
He opens with embarrassingly saying that the mainstream critics can be wrong, but in this arbitrary instance they were right. There's nothing to support this, he just says it. He also just says that hatred for Dark Souls 2 came from rose-tinted fanboyishness, which once again, he only responded to about 3 of Matt's points and hasn't proved him wrong, while also not proving the criticisms of Dark Souls 2 to be anything but valid. Yet he makes this claim. He says the game has been given ridiculous treatment. He hasn't shown us what the treatment is or why it's unfair.
I think the sheer surprise of how good Dark Souls was, after most people missed the boat on Demon Souls, made it a hard act to follow, and lots of fans got unrealistic expectations about it. The online response to Dark Souls 3 sounds overall lukewarm but positive, and I think that might be because, at least in regards to this one series, maybe not a couple others, people have cooled and learned to manage their expectations.
He says that people may have gotten unrealistic expectations for Dark Souls 2. Perhaps this is true, but personally I don't think it's unrealistic to want a good sequel to a game. That should be something that the developers are more than able to pull off. He says that Dark Souls 3 has had a lukewarm but still better response than Dark Souls 2, and it could be because fans have cooled, when in reality it's more to do with the fact that the game is actually very well made, though it was a little bit too referential to Dark Souls 1 and took more of the arbitrary elements without maintaining something of a fantastical world once again.
I'm interested in finally getting to play it after working for so long on videos about the games that preceded it. I'm a little worried that the fan reaction to some aspects of 2 made them walk back on the good ideas in an effort to be more like the first one, but I'm going to play it and judge it on its own merits as its own game before I really consider that.
He's just sharing his perspective here, and that's fine, but it is interesting to see him preemptively begin his next video in relation to the Souls series, and that will likely be on Dark Souls 3 and how it was terrible because it removed much of what Dark Souls 2 brought to the table. From what I know, Dark Souls 3 kept all of the positive design choices from Dark Souls 2 that were innovations, true evolutions of the series. It kept the very best that Dark Souls 2 had to offer. Like, 4 rings instead of 2.
In the meantime, Dark Souls 2 is not perfect, but you can have a grand old time with it. The gameplay contains some of the tightest moments in the whole series, and some really fun variations on the formula. It tells a story that, instead of redoing the original or trying to build on it in a straightforward way, self-consciously explores what it means to exist in a specific position in gaming culture, and asks us what the things we desire from games say about us.
So we are now into the conclusion of the series, the part where we make some statements as a result of the information we have just been through, and Harris opens with saying that Dark Souls 2 isn't perfect. This is true. You can have fun with the game. This is true. The gameplay contains some of the tightest moments in the series. Considering the janky hitboxes, backstabs, the restrictive movement, the inconsistent PvE, the broken focus system, the several other fundamental elements of the game, there is nothing anyone can objectively say about the game containing tighter moments than Dark Souls 1 or 3's refined systems. I will be proving what I just said in the future video, but we've not covered it yet, so just believe me for now, okay? There's evidence for all of this. Besides, this means nothing coming from Harris, because as he already admitted, he hasn't played Dark Souls 3 at this point, and yet he will confidently claim Dark Souls 2 are some of the tightest moments of the series. This is the kind of unsubstantiated statement you would expect from a fanboy. He says they have fun variations on the formula, which is about as vague as you can get, but then he gets philosophical on us and says the game explores what it's like to exist in a specific position in gaming culture and asks what things we desire from games and what it says about us. This is absolute nonsense. You guys need to listen to me here. This is nonsense. It's been put at the end to pretend there is something incredibly deep about the game and its poorer quality. This is something he's done already, claiming that something is broken on purpose and the reason is so deep that everyone missed it. I really do advise that you ignore unsubstantiated sophistry like this. It absolutely serves no purpose but to pop out of nowhere to gain brownie points and convince the audience something amazing happened. By the way, Harris does this on purpose. He is fully aware of it. He even makes fun of himself for it in other YouTube videos. Look at this.
Here's the part where I wrap up and give some pithy comments about how developers have things to learn from Bloodborne.
And now, think about that statement when listening to this.
It tells a story that, instead of redoing the original or trying to build on it in a straightforward way, self-consciously explores what it means to exist in a specific position in gaming culture, and asks us what the things we desire from games say about us.
It's just funny when you put this stuff together because it can show how much of a charlatan certain YouTubers are. They know what to do. They know how to tell a story in their own videos. And humans love stories, however bad or good, with Dark Souls actually being strong evidence for that. So Harris ends his video with this to make the journey feel like it would lead up to here. But honestly, if you would listen to what he actually said, he's just trying to make this project feel deep and meaningful, when all he's just done for over an hour is ramble on about bad things mysteriously being excellent things and attack other content creators for proving the game to be flawed. Listen to his video, folks. You will end up finding more shit to criticize than I do, I swear.
I really enjoyed Dark Souls 2, and I think there's a lot of things that make it good, and if you didn't enjoy it, that's okay. Your different opinions and experiences are equally as valid, and I know I talk authoritatively sometimes, but I hope it's clear I'm just offering my opinion in a way I think is interesting or convincing, and it's okay to disagree with me. For now.
Harris then ends his video in saying everyone can have an opinion, which is fine. He then says he may talk authoritatively, but you should know that when he does it, it isn't meant to be authoritative. That it is simply meant to be an entertaining way of being convincing or interesting. An interesting way to be convincing. This is the worst quote of the entire video. This is probably the worst quote of all of his work. This is something I have a huge problem with. It isn't just Harris though. He is a part of a larger group of people who either accidentally or deliberately fuck up language to say something definitively when they simply want to. The typical example is when Joseph Anderson authoritatively exclaimed that Soma was not a horror game. People do it all the fucking time, and as you saw here, Harris is saying it works as a way to convince people of your perspective, and he's right. When people hear you make a conclusion and haven't understood the evidence or haven't felt the evidence was all there, they will often be taken away by how you stated that last conclusion. But as I said, you should really just see if what they said helped you understand the topic more, or if you just wanted to listen to someone talk about games like many of my audience may actually watch my videos for, then that's okay too. It just bugs me that people keep getting away with such poorly made videos. Like, you may be confused here. I am saying it's bad writing. It's not like he's using it to be special in terms of convincing people something. You should only get to make definitive claims like that once you've actually shown reason for the claim to be conclusive. But you know what? This is just a precursor. This is going to be something I cover more and more as my videos go on. I'm almost certain of it. Harris finishes by jokingly saying that it's okay to disagree with him for now, but it is very clear with how he reacted to Matthewmatosis that he does not like being on the wrong side of the argument and will force the idea that he is right regardless of the topic. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is every last point in his video fully responded to. I know there is a fringe element of people out there who wanted this video to exist. Hell, I'm one of them. But of the responses I've seen so far, near enough all of them begin their video with saying they're not going to respond to every point because that would be ridiculous. Well, I fucking did it. But I imagine that this entire video series will slink under the carpet and my fanbase will have something to chew on, but if it gets linked to other places and discussion happens, that's cool too. Overall, Harris has created a terrible video. This thing is honestly his worst work, and it comes directly from his love for the product. He can't defend it properly, and even if he could, the game still falls short in many ways. Many objective ways. I didn't make this series because I hate Harris. I actually like him a lot. I could see myself getting along with him very easily. I won't be unsubscribing for a hell of a long time as long as he keeps being interesting to me. But the reason I was thorough and unforgiving is because I actually kind of care about him, as gay as that sounds. To put it a better way, here is Logicked explaining why he criticized Armoured Skeptic. Both of them have known each other for a long time, but Armoured Skeptic may have made a few mistakes in a video as of recently, and so Logicked felt the need to explain why he was so harsh to Armoured Skeptic rather than being extremely friendly, let's say. And I think it pretty much entirely applies to this situation.
When I call out people I didn't expect to have to call out, I'm a little bit harsher, yeah. It's kind of this thing of like, I thought you were better than that, dude. What are you doing? I use a sledgehammer to make sure that message is actually going to get through, not just to you, but to your audience. And that's what's going to happen again in this video. I find it really important that I criticize you on this, and not in a tweet.
I honestly think you're better than this, Harris. You've made way better videos, and I think it would be pretty awesome if you honestly remade your Dark Souls 2 video, or at the very least made a part 2 to clear things up. I don't know. Overall, I hope feelings weren't hurt, but that's practically unavoidable, and if ever Harris somehow saw these videos, which would be very unlikely, then I would love to discuss his ideas about Dark Souls 2 and the series in general, but I don't think he's gonna like me very much after seeing this, if he sees it. So I guess I'll simply say, join me next time, folks, when we're basically going to lay out the positives of Dark Souls 2 as well as the grueling negatives. I hope you've enjoyed this series so far, but those who are only interested in watching the responsive parts of the series, that is now over. Next time, it's all me, baby. Thanks for watching, guys. See you next time. He claims he just wants to understand why people feel the way they do, which normally would be fine, but he still hasn't addressed the majority of Matthewmatosis' videos' criticisms He claims that he just wants to understand why people feel the way they do, which normally would be fine, He claims he just wants to understand why people feel the way they do, which normally would be fine, but he still doesn't address the majority of Majosis. What's a Majosis?
But no, it turns out my perspective can be flawed.